Minutes after takeoff from Dubai, the pilots of a UPS Boeing 747 are face to face with their worst nightmare. Behind them, a cargo pallet containing over 81,000 lithium batteries has caught fire. Smoke rapidly fills the cockpit, and the pilots are desperately trying to race back to the airport. With every passing second, the fire is spreading and intensifying. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, the captain's oxygen supply fails. Will they be able to make it back to the airport before their massive plane is consumed by flames? This is the story of UPS Flight 6. On the evening of September 3rd, 2010, two pilots boarded UPS Flight 6 at Dubai International Airport. The massive aircraft, a Boeing 747-400, had arrived in Dubai from Hong Kong that afternoon, carrying a large consignment of cargo, including a few tons of lithium batteries. Some of this cargo had been unloaded at Dubai, while more cargo was loaded onto the aircraft. The plane's next stop was in Cologne, Germany, a 7-hour flight. The pilots who would take the plane on this journey were two Americans, 48-year-old Doug Lamp and 38-year-old Matthew Bell. Captain Lamp was an experienced pilot, having amassed over 11,000 hours of experience, 4,000 of which were on the 747. He had worked for UPS since 1995 and had a spotless safety and performance record throughout his flying career. First Officer Bell was also reasonably well experienced, with over 5,000 hours flying time, about 1,500 of which were on the 747. He had been with UPS since 2006, and, like the captain, had a spotless record in all of this time. The pilots had been in Dubai for the last 24 hours, having just flown themselves in from Hong Kong the previous day. When they reached Cologne, they would spend 55 hours there before flying back to the United States. So far, this was shaping up to be a completely routine trip for the crew of two. At 20 minutes to 8 local time, Flight 6 pushed back from its stand at Dubai. On board were 87 tons of fuel and 103 tons of cargo. The weather on this night was perfect for flying. The sky was clear and the winds were light. The first officer would be flying the aircraft to Cologne, with the captain acting as pilot monitoring. The aircraft itself was 3 years old, and was actually one of the last 747-400s ever made, before Boeing started production of its successor, the 747-800. The plane was in perfect flying condition, apart from one thing. The previous crew, who had flown the aircraft in from Hong Kong that afternoon, had reported a fault with Pack 1. Pack, in this context, stands not for package, but for Pressurization Air Conditioning Kit. This is a system which takes air from the engines, cools it, and feeds it into the cabin of the aircraft to keep it pressurized. On the 747, there are 3 packs, helpfully labelled Pack 1, Pack 2, and Pack 3. It is perfectly safe to fly with one faulty pack, and besides, Pack 1 appeared to be working. But there is one type of emergency for which a functioning Pack 1 is an absolute necessity. We'll get to what that is in a moment. At 10 minutes to 8 that evening, First Officer Bell lined the 747 up with runway 30 right at Dubai and pushed the 4 powerful engines to takeoff thrust. Within moments, the aircraft lifted off into the Arabian Night. In about 7 hours, it will be touching down in Germany. As it was a calm evening at Dubai, the first officer flew the aircraft manually on departure. As a pilot flying 747s on long-haul routes, the vast majority of your time is spent on autopilot, so it's good practice to fly by hand when the workload is light. It wouldn't be long, however, before the first officer's workload was like nothing he had ever experienced in his career. And all that started about 10 minutes after takeoff at 8 o'clock, when the pilots received a warning message on their cockpit's central display. It read, Pack 1 fault. This was the same issue the previous crew had noted on their way in from Hong Kong. The first officer turned on the autopilot as the flight climbed through 11,500 feet, and the captain went through the procedure to reset the faulty pack. Once he had done this, the error message disappeared, and everything went back to normal. The flight continued climbing up to its cruising altitude of 32,000 feet. This minor inconvenience would soon be forgotten by the pilots, but it would come back to haunt them in a completely unexpected way. At 10 minutes past 8 that evening, the pilots transferred from Dubai Air Traffic Control to Bahrain Air Traffic Control. This was shaping up to be a routine flight, and the pilots chatted amongst themselves as the plane climbed up to its cruising altitude. But at 13 minutes past 8, all signs of normalcy vanished in the cockpit when the fire bell sounded. This is one of the most urgent and terrifying alarms you can hear on any flight deck. The two pilots jumped into action. Their central display, known as the ECAS, notified them that there was a fire on the forward section of the main deck. They had to get to an airport immediately. The accident history of onboard fires is very clear. Once there is a fire warning, pilots typically have about 17 minutes to get the aircraft down, before the fire does that for them. Captain Lamp took over control of the aircraft from the first officer. He notified Bahrain Air Traffic Control that they had an onboard fire, and that they needed to land as soon as possible. The controller told the captain that Doha's airport was just ahead of them to the left, about 100 miles away. This was a lot closer than Dubai, which was now 180 miles behind the plane. But the captain had already decided that he wanted to return to Dubai. He was more familiar with the airport. He knew what the weather was and what the traffic situation was there, and he had all the charts ready to go. If he tried to land at Doha, he would have to get his hands on all of that additional information, on top of dealing with an in-flight fire. And besides, at this point, he didn't know how serious the fire was. So, he began a 180-degree turn and put the aircraft into descent. Both pilots donned their oxygen masks, and the first officer began working through the fire main deck checklist. This here is a copy of the exact checklist he was using. It contained a number of important steps which would give the crew a fighting chance at controlling or even extinguishing the fire. Primarily, this involved turning off Pack 2 and Pack 3 and opening a pressure release valve in the rear of the aircraft's fuselage. This depressurized the cargo area of the aircraft. In other words, the air was now being sucked out of the cargo area in a controlled decompression. This was a vital step in fighting the fire, because it deprived it of oxygen. At the high altitude the plane was at, the air only has about a third as much oxygen as it has on the ground. For that reason, the checklist also instructs the crew to maintain an altitude of 25,000 feet for as long as possible on the way back to the airport. In fact, this step is so important that even if the fire begins while the plane is below 25,000 feet, the checklist tells the pilots to climb to 25,000 feet. As the 747 didn't have any onboard fire suppression system, using the plane's altitude to fight the fire was the only method available to the crew. But the crew were as yet unaware of the extent of the fire. In fact, the whole thing was still rather abstract to them. The plane was flying normally, and they couldn't hear, see, or smell anything odd. In many ways, this was just like the many times they had practiced this scenario in the simulator. Despite the urgency of their situation, the pilots remained cold and clinical in their response to the fire indications. But this period of calm would be brief. The pilots don't know it yet, but just behind them, on the main cargo deck, a massive fire has taken hold. Unfortunately for the pilots, this fire had actually started minutes earlier, during the plane's climb. The 747 is not equipped with thermal imaging equipment. Instead, it just relies on smoke detectors to determine whether there is a fire on board. And by the time there was enough smoke to trigger the detectors, the fire had already reached an uncontrollable size. One of the lithium batteries in one of the pallets had self-ignited, and the fire had spread to the nearby batteries, setting off a chain reaction. A lithium battery fire is unlike any other kind of fire. When lithium-ion batteries burn, they make their own oxygen. not even the thin atmosphere at 25,000 feet could keep this fire from raging. In fact, not even water or fire retardant foam would have been able to stop them. Lithium battery fires are so dangerous, in fact, that even carbon dioxide fire extinguishers actually make them worse, because the batteries manage to split the carbon dioxide, CO2, into C and O2. That's O2, oxygen. In other words, lithium-ion battery fires can actually turn fire extinguishers into fuel. So, as the pilots turned their aircraft back to Dubai and actioned their checklists, they were in a desperate fight against the clock. They had to make it back to Dubai before the raging inferno beneath them rendered their aircraft uncontrollable. During the turn back to Dubai, the captain tested the controllability of the aircraft by disconnecting the autopilot and flying manually, then reconnecting the autopilot and then disconnecting it again. The flight controls appeared to be working normally, so he continued hand-flying the plane as the first officer worked through the checklists. But now, as if the pilots didn't have enough on their hands, the faulty Pack 1 blinked out again. And amid the flurry of warnings in the cockpit, the pilots didn't see that it had stopped working. This problem, while nothing more than an inconvenience when everything was going well, was now about to wreak havoc in the cockpit. The fire checklist says the Pack 1 must remain on because it keeps the air pressure higher in the cockpit than in the rest of the plane. This pressure difference prevents smoke from travelling from the cargo bay into the cockpit. But with Pack 1 now off, there was nothing to stop the smoke from making its way up to the cockpit. Except there was one thing, actually. One last line of defence. Lining the main deck was a heavy-duty fire-resistant material. It acted like a thick padded blanket, keeping the rest of the aircraft safe from the soaring temperatures in the main deck. So far, it was holding up against the raging inferno. Whether it would stay that way was an open question. At this point, the captain asked air traffic control if he could descend to 10,000 feet. It's still not clear why he did this. The checklist called for him to stay at 25,000 feet in order to starve the fire of oxygen. But it's possible that he was concerned not about whether the fire had oxygen, but about whether he would continue to get it from his mask. He knew that at 10,000 feet, he wouldn't need an oxygen mask, as the air would be breathable. The controller cleared Flight 6 down to 10,000 feet, and the captain continued his descent. At this point, the aircraft was still 100 nautical miles from the airport, or about 180 kilometers. Then, mere minutes after the fire bell sounded, the pilots received the first terrifying sign of the true extent of the fire. Thick black smoke began pouring into the cockpit. This emergency was no longer an abstract ordeal made of warning bells and lights. The fire-resistant lining which padded the walls and ceiling on the main deck had been breached. Dark, noxious fumes began to envelop the pilots as they raced at full speed back to Dubai. But then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, the unthinkable happened. The captain noticed that his control column had become completely ineffective at controlling the pitch of the aircraft. When he pulled up or pushed down, nothing happened. It was as if he was playing with a toy steering wheel, completely disconnected from the aircraft he was flying. This was an absolutely gut-wrenching moment for the captain. Without the ability to control the pitch of his aircraft, he knew that his chances of survival had plummeted. And on top of this, he also knew that there was only one thing which could have caused this loss of pitch control, and it was a terrifying prospect. It meant that the fire was now burning so hot that it had weakened the cables and pulleys which ran from his control column in the cockpit underneath the upper deck and back along the length of the aircraft to the tail. These cables require a certain tension to work properly, and the incredible heat of the fire had now weakened them and thrown the tension completely off. This would have been a death sentence for the crew, were it not for one important caveat. The captain was now flying manually, but on the 747, the autopilot controls the pitch of the aircraft not by pulling these cables from where the captain was sitting, but directly from the tail of the aircraft. So while the captain was unable to control the pitch of the aircraft, the autopilot, at least for the moment, was able to. But in the middle of the emergency, the captain didn't know this. He said to the first officer, "I have no control of the aircraft." "Okay, what?" "I have no pitch control of the aircraft." "You don't have any control at all." At this point, the pilots were only 4 minutes into the emergency. The sheer speed of the fire's escalation was horrifying. They were now in a race against an inferno, which had turned the rest of the aircraft into a hellscape. They were still well over 100 kilometers from the airport, and the fire had already crippled their flight controls. The captain was flying the aircraft as fast as it could go without exceeding its structural limits. Both pilots knew that they had mere minutes to get the aircraft back onto the ground. In cargo aircraft, there's no real need for a cockpit door, so this 747 didn't have one. This meant that as soon as the fire had breached the protective lining on the main deck, smoke had been spewing freely into the cockpit. This made for horrific conditions for the pilots. With every passing minute, it became increasingly difficult for them to see their instruments. And the smoke did more than just obscure their view. It was highly toxic. If the pilots hadn't put their oxygen masks on, they would be dead within minutes. But terrifyingly, their oxygen supply itself was now under threat from the fire. Beneath the cockpit, the lines leading from the captain's oxygen cylinder to his mask were being torched by the ever-intensifying fire. If they became compromised, the captain's oxygen supply would give out, and he would have to quickly make his way to one of the supplemental oxygen masks in the rear of the cockpit and fix the mask to his face in time. It was absolutely vital that the crew managed to get back to Dubai immediately. As smoke filled the cockpit, the pilots began to have trouble seeing their instruments. The smoke was so thick that it didn't just get in the way of the instrumentation, but it also obscured the cockpit lighting, turning the cockpit into a dark, murky box. There was no way the pilots would be able to make it back to Dubai like this. The captain called for the first officer to open the smoke shutter. The smoke shutter is a small hole in the cockpit roof. By opening it, the captain was hoping that he would be able to clear up the environment in the cockpit. And while this worked temporarily, it then had the totally unintended effect of drawing more smoke into the cockpit. The pilots couldn't win. It seemed as if everything they tried only made the problem worse. But that didn't stop them from preparing the flight computers for a landing back at Dubai. The first officer leaned forward until he could see his flight management computer through the thick smoke. The pilots knew that there was no way they would be able to see well enough out the window to land the aircraft visually. But the 747 has an excellent autopilot and auto-land system. If they could put the aircraft on course for Dubai, they could set the autopilot up to land the aircraft back on the same runway they took off from, runway 12 left. To do this, they would need to tune their navigation radios to the ILS frequency of the runway. The ILS, or Instrument Landing System, would give the autopilot lateral and vertical guidance down to the runway surface. And at 19 minutes past 8 that night, they managed to do just that. The ILS was now tuned, and the aircraft was on course to intercept the extended runway centerline for runway 12 left at Dubai. Now all the pilots had to do was keep the aircraft flying fast enough so that it would reach the runway before burning up entirely. But things were about to take an horrific turn for the worse. Less than a minute after tuning the ILS frequency for runway 12 left, the captain's oxygen supply suddenly failed. He needed to get his hands on another mask, fast. The conditions in the cockpit were hellish. Alarms blared, the air was hot and smelled of burning plastic and sulfur, and it was impossible to see further than a few inches in front of your face. There was a tremendous noise from the sound of air rushing past the fuselage, and the pilots were acutely aware that behind them, the blazing inferno causing all of this was drawing closer by the minute. The captain told the first officer that he had no oxygen and that he couldn't breathe. But there was nothing the first officer could do to help him. He was on his own. behind the pilots, at the jump seat position, there was a supplemental oxygen mask. The captain got up from his seat and told the first officer to fly the aircraft. He began making his way to the back of the cockpit, desperately wading through the toxic smoke in search of the portable oxygen bottle stored there. From this moment onwards, there would be nothing heard from the captain. Within seconds, he was overcome by the toxic smoke and fumes. The first officer was now completely on his own. Out over the Persian Gulf, 100 miles from the nearest land, he now had mere minutes to wrestle his flaming jet back to Dubai. But as the first officer sped towards Dubai, a new problem emerged. This had to do not with the fire, but with the plane's location. All this time, the plane's radios had been tuned to Bahrain air traffic control. But radio waves work by line of sight, and as UPS 6 flew away from Bahrain and descended, it actually went below the horizon from the point of view of Bahrain. So now, when the first officer tried to contact air traffic control, he heard nothing in response. The smoke in the cockpit was now so dense that the first officer couldn't see the figures on the radio panel beside him. If he had been able to see them, he could have tuned in to Dubai's frequency, which was in range. From there, he would have been able to coordinate his arrival back to the airport with Dubai air traffic control. But this wasn't an option. The smoke was simply too thick for him to make out what frequency he was tuned to. The first officer was now flying blind. So, he had to make do with the only option available to him. He would have to ask another aircraft in the area to relay his messages to air traffic control and to relay air traffic control's responses back to him. He wanted air traffic control to give him directions back to the airport and to keep him updated on his altitude and speed. Here's how it worked. The first officer radioed a nearby aircraft, Fly Dubai Flight 751, asking for directions to Dubai. Flight 751 radioed this request to Bahrain air traffic control. But Bahrain didn't have Flight 6 on radar, so they had to contact Dubai over the phone to get this information from them. Dubai told Bahrain the heading and distance of Flight 6 from the airport, and Bahrain radioed this on to the relay aircraft, who radioed it back to the first officer on Flight 6. This was an incredibly time-consuming and error-prone process. It was like a twisted game of Chinese whispers, where the life of the first officer depended on fast and accurate information from everybody involved. The first officer was under tremendous stress. He was already in a life and death battle to get the plane back to Dubai. His captain was unconscious, probably dead. The cockpit was full of toxic smoke. He couldn't see out the window or see his own instruments. And now he couldn't even talk directly to air traffic control to guide him back in. His level of stress was now through the roof. Where was he? Was he heading in the right direction? How would he know when it was time to slow the aircraft down and descend towards the runway? The minutes ticked by as the fire blazed on, growing more intense by the minute. Flight 6 was now 30 miles from Dubai. As the first officer radioed air traffic control via the relay aircraft, there was massive confusion as messages bounced between controllers and other pilots. Dubai controllers had no idea how urgent the situation was. All they knew was that Flight 6 had a smoke problem and was trying to return to the airport. The first officer was still flying at breakneck speed. For all this time, he had been waiting for some sign of the airport, some sign that he wasn't still miles out over the Persian Gulf. And finally, at 8:36 that night, the aircraft's onboard systems detected the glide slope for runway 12 left at Dubai. Flight 6 was now close enough to the runway to pick up this vital signal. If the first officer could coax the stricken aircraft into following this beam, he could be in with a fighting chance. He selected an altitude of 4,000 feet on the autopilot and put the aircraft into a descent. Thankfully, the aircraft appeared to be controllable via the autopilot. For the first time since the fire began, things were starting to look up. But the situation was still desperate. Somehow, the first officer would have to slow the overweight aircraft down to landing speed, all while descending rapidly and staying on course for the runway. At the moment, he was way too high. Air traffic control advised him that he was 9 miles from the runway and was descending through an altitude of 7,000 feet. Typically, at this distance, planes would be at about 3,000 feet. In other words, the first officer was more than twice as high as he needed to be. The relay aircraft asked if Flight 6 could do a 360-degree turn to lose altitude and airspeed. But the first officer knew that he didn't have time. This was his only shot. It was all or nothing. In a desperate attempt to reduce his airspeed, the first officer extended the aircraft's speed brakes, which popped up from the top surface of the wings. However, due to mechanical damage to the cables from the fire, the spoilers didn't extend as much as they should have. The plane continued in at high speed. The first officer also attempted to lower the landing gear, both in an attempt to set the plane up for landing and to help slow it down. The first officer lowered the flaps as well, first to 20 degrees, then to 30. At the speed he was travelling at, he didn't need the flaps for lift, which is their usual purpose. He needed them to help slow the aircraft down. The first officer was throwing everything he had at this new problem of airspeed, but the aircraft was only partially cooperating. It would not allow the flaps to extend beyond 20 degrees, as doing so would damage them. He put an altitude of 1,500 feet on the autopilot and continued descending. Next, the gear disagree warning alarm sounded. This told the first officer that the landing gear were not extended, despite him having lowered the lever. This is the last thing he wanted to hear, this close to landing. Except, he still didn't know how close to landing he actually was. He wasn't able to see out the windscreen because of the smoke. Was he still lined up with the runway? Was he still too high? He asked air traffic control, and found out the horrifying truth. He was, at that moment, flying over the runway at 4,000 feet. Dubai was now off the cards for landing. Bahrain Air Traffic Control, through the relay aircraft, suggested Sharjah, 10 miles to the left of the plane. The controller instructed him to turn left onto a heading of 095 degrees, roughly east. This really was the first officer's last chance. 10 miles was enough distance for him to descend. The only question was whether he'd be able to touch down on the runway before fire consumed the aircraft's flight control cables completely. But in the dense smoke and fumes, the first officer made a mistake. Rather than turning his heading selector to 095 degrees, he turned it to 195 degrees. The plane began a sharp turn to the right, away from Sharjah. As the plane banked hard to the right, the bank angle alarm sounded.
Bank angle.
The first officer desperately asked the relay aircraft to get the controller to tell him his altitude and heading. He had no idea where his plane was taking him. As the plane rolled out on its new heading, it began slowing down and descending. The first officer disconnected the autopilot, and without it to hold the nose up, the aircraft entered a dive. The nose pitched down to 14 degrees below the horizon. The first officer pulled fully back in his control column, but it had been rendered almost completely ineffective by the fire. The plane was now heading directly towards a residential area called Silicon Oasis, which was home to many pilots and cabin crew from Emirates Airlines. If the first officer was unable to pull the plane out of its dive, the death toll on the ground could be enormous. Finally, at just 1,000 feet above the ground, the first officer managed to pull the aircraft out of its terrifying descent. But only just. The aircraft limped upwards by about 500 feet, but as it climbed, its airspeed began to drop. And as the airspeed dropped, the elevator in the plane's tail became less effective at keeping the nose up. So, after just a few seconds, the plane entered what would be its final descent. This time, there was nothing the first officer could do. He was simply too close to the ground to recover. He did everything he could, pulling the control column fully back for the entirety of the plane's descent, in a desperate last-ditch effort to pull the plane up. But it was no good. At 41 minutes past 8, UPS Flight 6 smashed into the ground, igniting an enormous fireball which spread outwards from the disintegrating aircraft. Neither pilot survived. Incredibly, the plane had narrowly missed the residential area, sparing those on the ground. During the investigation which followed the crash, 3 pilots recreated the flight in a full-motion flight simulator. One of them described the task faced by the first officer of Flight 6 as mind-boggling. There was so much for him to do alone in the cockpit that it was incredible he even managed to get as far as he did. In the best of times, flying a plane is a 2-person job. In a critical and rapidly deteriorating emergency like that faced by UPS 6, having only 1 pilot in control was an utterly impossible situation. And then, what about the captain's decision to turn back to Dubai? Would it not have been better for him to continue to Doha, which was nearly half the distance away? Investigators tested this, but in the end, they were unable to tell whether diverting to Doha would have made any difference. The captain's oxygen failed long before the plane would have reached the airport, and the elevator control cables were also damaged significantly by that point. By all appearances, Flight 6 was doomed from the start. To prevent similar occurrences in future, the final report into this accident recommended that cargo aircraft in particular be fitted with fire suppression systems given the heightened risk of fire versus passenger aircraft. It also recommended that thermal detection be used in conjunction with smoke detectors in cargo compartments to give pilots earlier warning of fire. There were also some recommendations for cargo containers themselves. If the fire on board UPS 6 had been confined to its container for just a few minutes longer, this, coupled with an early detection and suppression system, would have given the pilots precious minutes to return to an airport. So, the final report recommended that cargo containers themselves be made more capable of withstanding heat and fire. These recommendations, and the changes which resulted, came too slow for the pilots of UPS Flight 6, but they've since been rolled out across many of the world's cargo fleets, making accidents like this much less likely. Take a look at this video here if you want to get an inside look at some of the causes behind an aircraft accident, or if you want to binge watch these episodes, you can click this playlist over here. If you'd like to vote on new episodes, or get a behind the scenes look at how we make these videos, you can check that out here on the Patreon, which I've put the link somewhere on screen. And I'm happy to announce that just this week, a little present arrived from YouTube. So thanks to everybody who's supported the channel so far, and here's to the 1 million mark.